Am I on? Good morning, everyone. We should get started. It's 10:32. My name is Marcus Robbins. I'm the University Archivist at Northern Michigan University. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you here to our session this morning about the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is very interesting. And we have a collection at the Northern Michigan University Archives, or the Central Upper Peninsula and NMU Archives. The Sceni Wildlife Refuge collection has a lot of material in there about the CCC. If you're ever interested, come to the archives and you're welcome to look at it. It's my great pleasure to introduce a man who probably doesn't need any introduction for most of you, Larry Chabot, who is a local historian, has done work in the archives and elsewhere. He's a native of Ontonagon, graduated from Georgetown University in Washington, DC. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. He worked at White Pine Copper Mine for 32 years, and he's written 2 books on the UP history. One is The UP Goes to War, and the other was Saving Our Sons. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Larry, and could you hold questions until after, and I'll go around with a microphone. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcus. Does anybody here have people who were in the CCCs? Wow. Quite a few. Do you know what camp they were in? Don't know, eh? Well, maybe this will be a little bit of help. I want you to take you back to 1933. None of us were probably around then or were out of our cradles. 1/4 of the country was on welfare. 1/4 of 1 out of every 4 people, no wage earner. In the Upper Peninsula, it was 45%. Almost half the people were out of work. They were on what newfangled thing called welfare. In Keweenaw County, it was 80%. Baraga County, 75%. These are staggering numbers when you realize that there was no wage earner in any of these families. And brand new welfare was not paying very much money. There were bank failures, there were business failures, all kinds of social and economic problems. Houses were being foreclosed at 1,000 a day throughout the United States at that time. There were hobos everywhere. Hobos, you know, are not bums or tramps. They're people who are between assignments. And they ride the rails here and there, going nowhere, going elsewhere. We had a hobo camp right near our home. These guys lived in tar paper shacks, and it was right next to the railroad tracks, and where the train had a very curvy road, and they had to slow down to 5 miles an hour, and these guys could jump on and off and head down south or stay up north. There were 2 million of these drifters throughout the United States, and 250,000 of them were children, including many girls who dressed as boys so they wouldn't be harassed. People were stealing food. They were stealing stuff from gardens. They were stealing stuff from trap lines. They were stealing out of mailboxes, especially on rural routes, looking for anything that would help them. Our streets were filled with beggars, according to one columnist at the time. And then in March 4th of 1933, Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated President of the United States, and he proposed a Civilian Conservation Corps to not only save these young people who had no future, but also to save the land. The reclamation of our land had gotten very little attention up to that time. Remember, this was March 3rd or March 4th. By March 31st, a bill was passed, he had signed it, and the CCCs were born and ready to go. The original plan was to pay them $30 a month, $1 a day. They were to be between the ages of 18 and 25. They had to have at least 3 teeth. They could be between 5 feet and 6'6". They had to be on relief. They had to be unemployed. You could not drop out of school in order to join. The neat part of this was that $25 was sent home to the families to spend. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Most of these people had no newspapers. They probably didn't have a radio. So it was word of mouth. It spread around that the government is hiring our kids. Where do I go? Where do I sign up? So they started signing them up at various welfare offices. There were 4 applicants for every single opening in the state of Michigan. The offices were jammed. The local reaction, though, was, we don't want these kids here. Oh, these tough kids from Detroit, Lansing, Grand Rapids, we don't want them. You know, put them somewhere else, not next to us. We're gonna have to lock our houses. We're gonna have to lock our cars. We're gonna have to hide our kids, our daughters. We'll see what happened to that attitude. In the Upper Peninsula, the headquarters, you gotta excuse me, I got a cold coming on. The headquarters were in the Sioux at Fort Brady. This was called the 6th District, and it included all of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Within 2 weeks of President Roosevelt signing this bill, the first kids were chosen, and they were on the way to Fort Custer for 2 weeks of hardening. The first camp in the UP was at Raco. I don't know if y'all know where Raco is, but it's just this side of the Sioux, about 20 miles. There were 5 more camps set up within the first week. So after 1 week, there were 6 camps. There were 1,200 enrollees and 270 staff members. It's a nice small town. The UP had a total of unbelievable 123 camps, which is more than half the states in the Union. There were 50,000 boys and young men who went through these camps. 30,000, I estimate, were Upers. It's very confusing to try and find the history of these camps because they went by several names. In fact, there are 8 camps named Manistee. I had to find out where they were, why they were called Manistee. Many of them had name changes as time went on. The one near me was, this is one of these N95 things. I have to wear it when I go to Norlight. This one to me was Poor Eye, which is in Houghton County. But the camp was named Mass City because that's where they got their mail. And that's 15 miles away, and it's in Ontonagon County. Some of these camps had 3 names, from where they got their mail, the name of the location, and the nearest railroad station. It took many, many months, partly with the help of my friend Marcus, to sort out all this mess, especially since all the records were lost in a fire. The Army ran the camps. They monitored the actions of the boys, and the Forest Service ran the projects. The first campers lived in tents, which they put up themselves. They had to cut the wood, haul off the stumps, and then spend time living in these camps with a little cot, sleeping on a cot, with a little wood stove until the winter quarters would be built. And this resulted in the hiring of every single carpenter in the Upper Peninsula. They even had to import a few. Their first job was to fight fires. This is an extremely, extremely dry time in the Upper Peninsula. Fires were being fought at the rate of 100 a week in different places throughout the UP. Some of them were massive fires that just destroyed, like Isle Royale lost 27% of its land to forest fires. There's a great deal of thought about people setting these fires in order to be hired to put them out. Many people believe that was true, and I'm one of them. The CCCs built fire towers all across the UP, and this cut the amount of fires by 91%. When the camps came into business, the money started to pour into these small towns because they were buying lumber, they were buying food, they were hiring doctors and dentists, even by hiring chaplains. They were spending federal money that started to help local business. And on the other hand, you had the people themselves whose income doubled if they had a boy in camp. Welfare was paying $22.34 a month on the average. So you get a kid who's sending $25 home, your income has doubled. So what are you going to do with this money? You go out and buy clothing, buy more food, maybe put gas in the car if you have one, maybe buy a radio. This money began to seep into the countryside, started to boost the economy in all of these little towns, even though they didn't want them in the first place. In today's dollars, $1 then is worth $21 now. So if you were making $5 as a camper, it was probably equal to, what's 5 times 21? $100. And the rest went home and they had to spend it. Although I know one guy, a friend of mine, who family saved the money and it was enough for him to go to Michigan State and get a graduate degree. Among the projects was, one of the most interesting was the Moose Project at Camp Cuzano, which was north of Shingleton in Alger County. They brought in moose from Canada, put them in corrals. I don't know what the purpose of this was. Do you know, Marcus? Why they wanted to have, they wanted to establish a moose population. It really didn't work too well. Not like the present day plan, which has produced hundreds of moose here. They brought in like 20 of them. One fell off the cliff at Pictured Rocks and died, and several others died of diseases, and finally it petered out, but it was pretty interesting. They also fought something called Blister Rust, which is a fungi growing on the pine trees. They spent a lot of time doing that. They built phone lines. As the telephone companies were expanding into rural areas, they also built power lines because the REA was coming along, the Rural Electrification Administration, and extending power to people who never had it before. They did fencing, they did drainage, they did surveys. They would interview fishermen and ask them where they caught their fish, how big they were there, what kind of bait they used. They would take deer surveys. They even surveyed rabbits, ducks, and then reported that to the conservation people. They built buildings, they repaired buildings. They did some boundary line with surveyors. They did a lot of trapping, and one of the biggest things they did, as Marcus mentioned, was the Sceni Wildlife Refuge, which was pretty much carried out by a camp in Germfest. They planted 2 different kinds of trees, mostly Norway pines and red pines. And as you drive around the UP, you can still see these things. You can see a row of trees, maybe a quarter of a mile long, all the same height, all evergreens, about 4 deep, and serving as almost as a windbreak. But this is what these guys did. I walked the camp at Kenton, and I could see the furrows are still there, where the harrow would come along, turn over, the kids would plant the trees. 500 million trees were planted in the Upper Peninsula by the CCCs. Countrywide, it was 3 billion, which was more trees that ever been planted in the United States in all the time since our independence. These kids learned how to cut a tree down. Kids from Detroit had never seen an axe. They didn't know what end to hold. They didn't know how to dig a hole. They didn't know how to change a flat tire because they were street smart and life dumb. And the CCCs, I think, brought them up to speed. One forest official said, "You won't know the Upper Peninsula woods when these boys get through with them," and that was absolutely true. The federal forest had 36 camps, state forest had 46. 7 of them were national parks. and one was a biological station at Sceni. These kids planted 156 million fish in ponds and streams and lakes throughout the Upper Peninsula. They spent 140,000 men, this is too many statistics I know, fighting forest fires. They built 500 bridges, built all kinds of buildings. They built 33 landing fields throughout the Upper Peninsula. Some of them are still in use. Private aviation was becoming more popular then as more and more people could afford planes. But the planes were all mechanical at that time and subject to frequent failure. And they appreciated the fact that practically every 20 miles was an airstrip that had been built by the CCCs, many of which are still used today. I was talking about Isle Royal. 27% of Isle Royal was burnt down in 1933 through 37. I was there about 15 minutes later, and you could still see the tree line and almost like a big notch on the west end where the fires were. The kids were able to learn on their own time from hundreds of different courses that were offered either by the CCCs or by universities like University of Michigan, University of North Dakota were very active in providing, I think it's 300 different courses that they could take to improve their skills. Whether it was carpentry or operating radios or anything else, you could learn it in the CCCs. Many kids learned how to be literate, to read and write. They had to write a letter and they had to learn how to read a newspaper. And 100,000 of them nationwide became literate that way. There were hundreds of types of labor that they could perform, from office work to work out in the woods. And here's where the UP kids had the advantage. They're used to bad weather, they're used to tough roads, they're used to handling items like axes and saws and whatnot. The CCCs were voted the third best program under the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt. You want to know what the other two was? One was welfare, direct payment welfare, and the other one was bank reform, which was badly needed at the time. I've seen testimony from hundreds and hundreds of families and guys, and I'd like to just read you some of the comments that they made. I joined because I was starving. My son was starving. He would have starved to death if I hadn't gotten him into the CCCs. Another guy said, I didn't believe there was this much food in the world. We sat down to a good meal. Some of these boys were so weak from being undernourished that they had to feed them for 5 or 6 weeks before they could even get out in the woods and cut down a tree. It's a good life and a good deal. These are the best years of my life. And so many of them said, this is the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm never sorry in the CCCs. I'll never forget the experience. It's the best federal program ever. It made a man out of me. The allotment home saved our farm. I had no self-esteem. I was underweight. I was underfed. I had no money. My life was hopeless. But in CCCs, I learned respect, discipline, and how to treat my fellow man. Made a man out of me. There's a man named John Simmons who really got me started on this project. I was working at the Historical Society, digging up obituaries from the year 1930. I would make a little card and give it to Rosemary, had the name of the person, when they died, what issue of the paper it was in, what column, what page number, and so on. And I came across a lot of stuff about the CCCs, but it really didn't interest me much until the librarian handed me this book called CCC Baycliff, or Baycliff, yeah, by John Simons, who was an architectural student at Michigan State and not otherwise eligible to join the CCCs. So he was hired to come up and help design Marquette, Camp Marquette, which is where I think where Huron Bay is now. I forget what that subdivision is named. So he comes up here, and his dad is driving him up, and there were no major highways. You go this way a mile, this way a mile, this way a mile, this way a mile. Once you cross the bridge, or there was no bridge, and you finally stop and ask somebody, "How do you get to Big Bay?" And this, when he stopped once, it was 10 miles away, and this kid said, "I don't know. I'll go ask my dad." So he asked his dad, and he said he doesn't know either. So he's dumped off in Big Bay, and he said this is the most dismal place on the face of the earth. And I got to spend a whole year here. At the end of the book, he says, leaving this place was the saddest day of my life. And I thought, I got to find out what happened to him in the meantime. How did he get this attitude? We got it because he was thrown in with another group of people. He was working on a project that was right down his line of business. He was taken care of food-wise, medical care, dental. He was satisfied with his life for the first time because it had meaning. I thought, I got to look into this. So I started going back to 1933, and I read every paper up, mining journal up through 1942 when the thing finally ended. So that sprung me into this research project, and one of the reasons I got in touch with Marcus here. This ended in 1942. The same people who were criticizing the establishments, the camp in their backyard, were now flooding Congress and the president with telegrams and letters asking that they not end this program. You had to have something for these kids to do. Their work isn't done yet. We got to, you're helping our local economy. We need these kids and this camp in order to stay alive. Well, it didn't do any good at all. I think it was Iron Mountain sent hundreds and hundreds of telegrams to the President of the United States, none of which were ever acknowledged. But on the other hand, there was no more reason for it because the boys were going into service or working at defense plants. There weren't enough applications. Instead of being in 6 months, you could stay in 2 or 3 years if you wanted. They were actually recruiting people for the first time. So in the middle of 1942, Congress ended the program. So what did you have left? You have all these kids who went through best time of their lives, best thing ever happened to me. They were tougher, they were stronger, they were actually heavier, they were taller, their teeth were fixed. They had a skill that they picked up. They knew how to make beds and sew and iron, so they made good husbands. There was a thought that all of the CCC boys should be sent directly into the service. But then somebody pointed out, hey, you're talking about punishing or penalizing the people who come from the lowest stratus of life, who don't have any jobs, and you're forcing all poorer people into the service. And that ended. I'd like to read an editorial. How are we doing on time, Marcus? Okay. There's an editorial in the Camp Pori newsletter. Every camp had a newsletter. And district headquarters also had a newsletter, and I was able to read dozens of these. This guy wrote, he said, I go back when I was an orphan at age 13. My spirits were low. I slept on tables in a restaurant where I worked, making sure that the manager never phoned me. But everything about the CCCs was enjoyable. I even loved KP duty. I loved the mud. I loved the coldest winters because I had nothing to worry about. I'm certain to have food and shelter and clothing the next day. It was a whale of a time for me. It now ends, and once again I sally forth, a little wiser, more patient, and better physically fit. I'm back on my feet again, thanks to the CCCs. So what happened to the camps? Some of them were demolished, some of them were auctioned off. I know of one camp that's still in existence in Iron County. All the buildings are there in Gibbs City, and it's used for many other things. Church groups, peace groups, Boy Scouts, and so on have used that camp. Most of the buildings were torn down. Some are still in existence. Some are in the Porcupine Mountain Wilderness State Park. And there's camps here and there. I know there's one in Newberry that serves as a museum. The items were auctioned off. All the bulldozers and the axes and everything else were gotten rid of. But then along came a whole bunch of prisoners from Germany. There were like 350,000 German soldiers, mostly from the Africa Corps, who had to be brought over to the United States because, frankly, there's no other place to put them. England was full, and most of the other countries were at war or were neutral. So they brought over to 5 different camps in the Upper Peninsula, including his Camp Pori, near where I lived. And one day the word came out that the Nazis are coming, the Nazis are coming. So every kid in the neighborhood gathered near our house with their toy guns. We were firing at these guys as they walked by. There might be 30 or 40 of them. They were laughing and joking. It was bang, bang, we were shooting nothing but air at them. But we never lost a kid. We all made it safely. I don't know where they were going, but that was my only contact with the POWs. Many of the camps, 21 of them, were used for training in World War II. There was 17,000 people guarding the Sioux Locks. On the other end of the peninsula at Ironwood, there was an MP military police camp. In my county, Monongahela, at Paulding, there was a medical evacuation team. 2 guys from which grabbed a train and went back to camp, and they just followed their footsteps in the snow. We wound up in prison, but that's the only example of a train robbery by a CCC boy. Here's the farewell prayer by one of the boys also from Pori. My only wish, one last request, when my soul is going west, may all my buddies hear my prayer, softly played in the silent air. May old glory ever wave over every CC grave. And then the lights went out and the CCCs were all done. But you folks here who had relatives, maybe even ancestors in the CCCs, know what it did to your people. There were very few defections. A lot of guys would quit, especially in the first day or two, and hitchhike back home. But there were plenty of people to fill their spots. I've gotten to know a lot of CCC guys, and every single one of them, without fail, said it was the best thing ever happened to them. And it's one program that paid its way and whose benefits are still with us today. Anybody have any comments or questions?
Well, thank you very much, Larry.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? I'll come around with the.
By the way, this is a map of all the camps in the UP, 123 of them.
This is kind of a related question. I was watching something on television and they said the reason school lunch programs got started for people that, couldn't afford lunches is that during the Depression, well, let me back up. World War II, when they went to draft people, so many of our young men were just malnutritious. They weren't fit for service because they're starving during the Depression. Can you comment on that?
Well, I know when there were 16 million and a half people in uniform in World War II from America. But there were hundreds of thousands that were turned down because of exactly what you're saying. They were either mentally or physically challenged. They were either so poor that they hadn't been able to eat. They were scrawny, they were underweight, or they had some physical ailment or some disease. So that's true. There were many people who never made it, but there's always replacements. So like I said, 16.5 million people. That's 1 out of every 8 Americans was in uniform in World War II. That answer your question, Ray? Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yes, I really glad to hear your presentation. My uncle fought in the Second World War, and he would relate stories about how the time, some of the best times he had were in the CCC camps. So it's really
Oh, that's interesting.
very touching to hear what you said.
I'm
Thank you.
glad that you heard those stories. Most people did not.
Never forget them. Thank you.
Oh. I'm going to show you this other map here. As long as we're talking about the war. Thank you, Marcus. This is proof why it was called a world war. I don't know if you can see all these little stars scattered across the world, some 10,000 miles away from the UP. There's one in Russia. There's one at the tip of South Africa. There's one in, Marcus was surprised, there's one in Australia. 1,508 UP men and women died in the war, and this shows where they lived, where they died. There's not a battlefield they weren't involved in. There wasn't a sea battle they weren't involved in. They were in airplanes flying over Japan, flying over Germany. They died in just about every place you can possibly think of, and some you can't possibly think of. But that's why it was called a world war. And the Upper Peninsula and every other area of the country will have a map like this, showing where other people died. 90,000 Americans are still unclaimed. We don't know where they are. Nobody knows if they're buried in unmarked graves. The federal government, especially the Navy, has been very active in trying to identify people. They started on people buried in mass graves in Hawaii, Honolulu, called the Punch Bowl, to identify the victims of the Oklahoma disaster, which killed 429 sailors on Pearl Harbor Day. And I have been able to work with 2 of the families whose relatives were identified and brought home for reburial. And I was honored to give the eulogy at both of these funerals. And it's now, of the 429 people, I think 380 have now been identified through the Navy's identification program, which is one of the great things that's happened after World War II, and trying to bring comfort to those families who had no idea what happened to their people.
I had some questions about Bay Clef. You mentioned it was first a CCC camp, and then what was the transition? 'Cause I thought it was a dairy farm at some point, and then they started by having children come in who were malnourished, and I didn't realize it was connected first to a CCC camp, but I didn't know.
I don't know that it was. I think the CCC camps were south of the town itself, like a mile or 2, whereas the Bay Cliff was founded by
Elba Morris and
Corneliuson,
yeah.
Who started this in the 1930s. I think it's a geographical coincidence that they're related next to each other. But
Okay.
Baycliff is one of those miracle places.
Yes.
Have you been there?
Oh, yes, yes, I've,
I've been there too. I couldn't, your eyes don't believe what you see. There's one family that turned their boy over and he was on a plank with wheels and he paddled himself into camp. They went back to get him 6 weeks later and he was walking towards them with his arms up. They say that happens all the time. Fabulous place, but I don't think there's a connection between the two.
You had a question over here? No? Anyone have more? Okay.
I just have a comment. My father-in-law was in the CC camps here in the Upper Peninsula. And a couple of things he talked about and that I remember is that he used to plant the trees
Mhm.
and they would plant them until they get to the end of the road so they have time to do a smoke. And then they go plant some more. And that was the only time they had a chance to smoke is at the end of the
Oh,
planting of the field and that too. So, and the other one, they had baseball teams too.
Right, yeah.
And they played the Detroit Tigers up there and he was a pitcher. He says, we beat them. And that's how much truth is it? I don't know. He told me that when we were at the
I
camp.
believe him.
And so, but he says they had a lot of fun that, but he says there was a lot of work. in that
They had
too, but-
baseball teams, they had a couple of football teams, basketball was really popular, boxing was extremely popular because that was a big sport in the 1930s. Each camp had a boxing team and they'd have tournaments. The tournaments and everything, bridge, chess, checkers, you name it. They had tree planting contests between the various camps. And these were young guys with a lot of spirit and once they got fed decently and taken care of medically, they had a lot of spunk and they just were busy all the time. Some of them got in trouble, stealing cars and doing all kinds of things that they shouldn't have been doing, but it wasn't any different than what's happening in the general population. It's just that it got publicity because they were from out of town and were raising hell in our neighborhoods. But that's interesting that they worked so fast, they got to smoke at the end of
That's- He always brought that up and that I
the.
kind of looked at him. I said, okay, what are you going to say? And that too. So
Well, they buy cigarettes with their $5 at the canteen.
I never thought of that at the time. And I just remember him saying, after we got through with the long rows, we had time for a quick smoke.
Yeah.
Then we do the next one and that too. So, and that, but he had good stories about that too. So
Oh, I'm glad you heard them and I'm glad he shared them because most people did not.
there was more, but that's the only two that really stuck in my
Yeah.
mind in that too.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Anyone else? John?
Are any of the CCC sites set up as historical sites that you can still go visit the camp area and see where people were working?
Well, there's one in Newberry. That's it's a museum right behind their regular museum. The only camp I know of is the one at Gibbs City in Iron County, which has been used by many organizations over the years, and it's pretty well complete. They started a program some years ago to put at least a sign where every camp was. They never finished the project, but I've seen signs all over the place. Camp so-and-so was here. They all had a number, either 3 digits for the early camps or 4 digits for the later camps. Every museum, county museum should have a display of some kind. I've been to many of them and they each have a CCC display, including pictures, these mass pictures of everybody. All 200 campers and the staff in one single picture is about 4 feet wide. So if you want to go to a local historical society museum and just ask them, you know, what do you have?
I forgot. I have a brochure from the Civilian Conservation Corps Museum downstate for the historical side
Right.
and that.
Yeah, down near Higgins Lake,
Right.
near
No.
Gaylord, they shut down during the Not during the pandemic. Before that, when the state was having financial problems, they shut it down. I don't know if they ever reopened it, but that's a good source to go to. They have a lot of stuff online.
Hello. Well, a bit of a story from Scandia area, Carl's End in particular. And I was told that the way that our farm, which was a Bell farm at the time, and that the good things happened. The horses were sent over to I think it was around 41, and that's what work was being done on that, and cement. They're using cement on 41, and every in the end of every day, the bags that were emptied out from cement were brought over to the farm, and that's how the basement got done for the farmhouse. And I suspect maybe there was a little more cement in the bag than was probably emptied out. So
That's one way to get it done, eh?
yeah, I think so. So I don't know I never heard what camp that would have been. Maybe somewhere closer to the area, maybe
They
Canary or
didn't
something.
have their own camps there, but a lot of side camps were sent into the Scandia Dukes area, Carl's End, like 30, 40 guys to work on a special project. Then they go back home either to Big Bay or Segola or somewhere else.
Yeah, there must have been the part of it that lent its way here for the farm.
Thank you. One of the most interesting camps was one that didn't exist. There was a clerk in Washington, DC, who invented a Camp Shenandoah, faked a roster, put his own address for all the checks. He got 4 years worth of checks. He cashed them all. He bought himself a mansion and a limousine and so on. But he got snagged when he was transferred. And somebody showed up in his old office with all the checks for Camp Shenandoah. But he had 4 years worth of fun, and he had 20 years to think it over behind bars. But there was an enterprising individual.
Larry, I'm from I live in the Gwin area. Where is the Gwin camp? I noticed you on there was a camp.
Well, there was one at New Swansea, which didn't last very long. There's one at Little Lake,
Really?
and that lasted about a year. But the big one was called Escanaba River. And it was south of Gwin around Kate's Grade. They move around from place to place to do their jobs, but the camp was in Escanaba River area around Kate's Grade. Those are the three I know of. One of the camps was moved to the entrance road to Sawyer Airport, the southern entrance road, not the northern one. It was right smack in the middle of the road, as a matter of fact.
Do you know what they were doing in that area? Were they
They're
planting?
planting trees mostly, and there are a lot of streams that they worked on to clear brush and set up fish traps and fish shelters and things of that nature. You have a copy of my book in your,
Yeah,
now why don't you just look up,
yeah, I will. All right.
look up especially Escanaba River.
Okay.
That was a big camp, lasted a long time.
Are there any other questions for Larry? Wow. Okay, Larry, thank you so much for this extensive research, and I mean, it's remarkable. It
Well,
really is
thank you for
remarkable
having me.
story.
I've heard about the Sonderegger for years, and now I'm finally a part of it. I'm very
long overdue.
humble about that.
We'll
I
have to
enjoyed
have
it.
you come and talk next time about your research on the war and
World War II,
yeah,
okay.
and what you've done
It's a
there.
deal. Thank you all.
I believe that the lunch is going to be in this room after this today. So thank you all very much for coming.